My name is Sheila McMahon. I am the director for the Women's Resource Center here at Boston College, and I am pleased to welcome you to this evening's program, Foremothers in Faith, Historic Women for Our Time. Tonight, as we continue an important conversation that was established by the Church in the 21st century through the C21 series on women, we are blessed with a very highly accomplished group of women theologians who will speak with us this evening about women who have inspired and guided their own thinking, theologizing, and praxis. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd just like to take a moment to thank the Church in the 21st Century staff, John McGinty, Nayla Raffel, and student worker Eden Prendergast, as well as Bob Newton and Rosemary Donahue from the University President's Office, for the opportunity to co-sponsor this rich and informative program, and for their continuing commitment to supporting women in the Catholic Church and here at Boston College. As well, I'd like to just recognize the members of the C21 Series on Women Advisory Group, without whose inspiration and support this event would not have been possible. The advisory group members include Kelly Armstrong, Kara Triniga, Maria DiCiapari, Kate Daly, Linda McKay, and Katie Spillman. And a special thanks this evening to Kate Daly, who designed the lovely programs that we have available at the table at the back of the room. And finally, thank you so much to the BC Media Technology Services, Bureau of Conferences under Dave Early, University Advancement, Information Technology Services, and so many other folks here at BC who helped to make our programs possible. And now to the panel. This evening, as we listen and learn together about the women of history upon whose faithful shoulders we now stand, I'd like to welcome our panelists who, like the women about whom they will be speaking, have accomplishments that are really too numerous to list in their entirety here this evening. And in the program, you'll find just a little bit of a brief biography of each of our panelists. So I will just introduce them by name and just with their current occupation here at Boston College. So we welcome this evening our panelist Lisa Sal Cahill, who is professor and the J. Donald Monin S.J. Chair in the Theology Department. Ruth Langer, who is associate professor of the Theology Department and also the associate director for the Center for Christian and Jewish Learning. And Ruth is also an ordained rabbi. So thank you for being here. Sean Copeland, who is an associate professor in the Theology Department. Pat DeLue, who is the vice provost for faculties at the Office of the Provost and Dean of Faculties. And as you'll note in the program, she's also trained in theology as well as being an administrator. And Colleen Griffith, who is the faculty director of spiritual studies for the Institute for Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry here at Boston College, and also an adjunct associate professor in our theology department. We'll have the opportunity this evening to hear from each of our panelists in turn, and then we'll have some time for conversation at your tables, after which we'll come back together as a group with our panelists, have some conversation and questions with them, and then we'll close the evening with a reception in the wings of the rooms here, to which you're all heartily welcome. So thank you so much for being here tonight, and thanks to our panelists.
Thank you. I'm Lisa Cahill, and I'm going to talk about Mary Magdalene, who is a biblical figure, and I'm going to argue that she's the most important woman in the New Testament, and there's very good New Testament evidence in favor of that claim. Probably, if you ask most Catholics, who is the most important woman in the New Testament, the answer would be Mary, the mother of Jesus. And in fact, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is important, but she's important mainly not because she's the biological mother of Jesus, but because she was also a disciple. In fact, there's a story that's recounted in all three synoptic gospels where Jesus is preaching to a crowd, and someone comes and says, "Your mother and your brothers are outside." And Jesus says in reply, slightly different versions in each of the three synoptics, but says essentially, my mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God and keep it, or who do the will of my Father in heaven. These are my mother and my sister and my brothers. That quotation is from Matthew's version. So the point is not that he's rejecting his mother, but that if his mother is important, it's because she hears the will of God and does it. And the figure in the New Testament who is given the most attention in that regard by Jesus is Mary Magdalene. Now, before I elaborate on the reasons why that's the case, let me just dwell for a moment on popular images of Mary Magdalene through the centuries. Just as most people would say that Mary, Jesus' mother, is the most important woman, so most people also have a very clear image of who Mary Magdalene is. And I've asked any number of undergraduate classes when we're reading the Bible, well, who is Mary Magdalene? And there are two answers, one sort of an immediate reaction and another if they know a little bit more about the Bible. And the first is she was a prostitute. She was a prostitute who repented and Jesus forgave her sins. And the slightly more sophisticated answer is she was the woman who came when Jesus was having dinner at somebody's house and broke a jar of perfume or poured a jar of perfume on his feet, bathed his feet with her tears, and dried his feet with her hair. Okay, and I brought, just as a little show and tell, you won't really be able to see this, but that's okay. I can just explain what it is. But the main point that I want to make is that this is an issue of Newsweek magazine from 2003. And the theme of it is Women of the Bible. And the reason this was published was because of the great flap over the book, The Da Vinci Code, the novel starring Mary Magdalene. And inside there is a story about the Bible and women. And right here is a reproduction of a picture from an oil painting from the 17th century, depicting Mary Magdalene, and it's called The Penitent Magdalene. And I want you to notice a few aspects of the picture, which I'll just describe. The first is you see this woman gazing at this little crucified Jesus up on a ledge in the corner. So she's thinking not of Jesus in a human sense as a lover or, paramour or much less a spouse, but as someone who was crucified and died for her sins. So she's reminded of her sins. It also shows her bare-breasted. She has nothing around her but a cloth, recalling her promiscuous lifestyle in her former life as a prostitute. You can see the edge of one breast under her arms, and she has long flowing hair, reminiscent of the woman in Luke chapter 7 who washed Jesus' feet with her hair. She is also wearing a little halo that I'm sure you can't see from there, but to show her saintly status because she gave up her former way of life. Now, the thing that is most striking to me about this depiction, and there are many similar depictions throughout Christian history, is that they tend to slot women, especially important biblical women, right in the old stereotypical women's role, which is a sexual role. And particularly in the case of Mary Magdalene, her importance is denigrated because she is put in a negative sexual role that she has to overcome or abandon in order to become close to Jesus. There have been several modern attempts to retrieve and rehabilitate Mary Magdalene, and they frequently consist in elevating her status to that of a lover or wife. In the 1970s, we had the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar, and in 2003, well, around that time, we had Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code. And the Da Vinci Code supposedly gives Mary Magdalene an important role and restores her true significance. And how does it do that? It makes her Jesus' wife and the mother of his children. So that instead of being in a negative stereotypical role, she's now in a positive stereotypical role. But the point of the New Testament is that discipleship does not depend on family relationships, however important those may be at a human level. And women's status as disciples does not depend on motherhood, however important that may be at a human level. So who then is the real Mary Magdalene in the New Testament? And I would like to just quickly say 5 things. Okay, first of all, Luke chapter 8 identifies her as a woman from whom Jesus had cast out 7 demons. 7 demons in the New Testament does not necessarily connote sin. There are other accounts of Jesus casting demons out of people, and they seem to have mental illness or be insane. For example, a man who is living among the tombs and is running around naked. So Jesus casts out the demons and then he's normal again. So we don't really know what that represents, but it should not be equated with being a prostitute. Secondly, shortly after that, Luke also says that Mary Magdalene was one of several women from Galilee who went around with Jesus and his apostles, the 12, and supported them out of their means. So they were women who had a little money who traveled with the apostles and helped pay their expenses. So they supported Jesus' mission. They were patrons or donors. Okay, secondly, Mary Magdalene, well, those are the first 2 things, I guess, that she, had 7 demons cast out and she supported Jesus out of her resources. So a third point is that Mary Magdalene was one of the women who was near Jesus at the time of his death, or at least this is how it's depicted in the New Testament, after most of the male disciples had fled. So they stayed at the foot of the cross. A further point is that the women then went to anoint the body after Jesus was dead. And that leads us into the most important feature, which has to do with the stories of the resurrection. All 4 Gospels portray Mary Magdalene as one of the first witnesses to the resurrection. And in at least 2 Gospels, Matthew and John, she sees Jesus before the male disciples, John and Peter, for example, the apostles. An even more important point is that Jesus tells Mary Magdalene to go and tell the others, to go and tell his brothers in John 20 and Matthew 28. So in other words, she is given the mission to preach the gospel. And finally, the wording in John's gospel is especially important because the word announced is used. It is said that Mary Magdalene announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," after Jesus having told her to go and do that. And that word announced is a very special word that is used in Greek to describe the apostles' mission in preaching the gospel. So in conclusion then, I'd like to call our attention to a status that Mary Magdalene has sometimes had in our tradition and deserves to have recovered. Bernard of Clairvaux, a medieval theologian, called her the apostle to the apostles. And John Paul II, in his letter on women, Mulieris Dignitatem, on the dignity and vocation of women, repeated that and called Mary Magdalene the apostle to the apostles. So Mary Magdalene, then, is an apostle for the same reasons and in the same way as St. Paul. Neither was one of the original 12. Both saw the risen Jesus and were sent by him to announce the gospel. So with that in mind, the question I would like to leave us with is what possibilities and questions does that leave us with in regard to the status of women in the church today, in the Catholic Church, in comparison with the 12 and with the other male disciples and apostles? Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Bring that down to my height. I'm Ruth Langer. I am the representative of non-Catholics on this panel, although in spite of the fact that some of the advertisement had it a little differently. I'm very honored to be here and to be part of this panel, and in some ways to provide a counterpoint to it, because it's actually profoundly challenging to me to be asked to find a woman who is a model for me in my life and the kinds of values that I hold. It's not the first time I've been asked to contribute to this sort of program, but it's a very big problem because there really didn't exist Jewish women who can serve, and it's not that there didn't exist Jewish women who can serve as models. I think there really did exist, that such people, but the literary culture that we depend upon for our knowledge about our models in the Jewish world was almost exclusively a male literary culture, and it just didn't bother to preserve women's traditions. What women's traditions there were probably oral, and if there's a breach in the oral transmission, it dissipates and disappears entirely. So the literature that we've received from the pre-modern period really marginalizes women and doesn't tell their stories at all. So contemporary scholarship is looking in the margins and in the corners of this male literature and is beginning to learn a great deal about women, but about women in general, and not about specifics that we can attach to individuals who have names, let alone faces. So my personal reality is one where women, just in the past few decades, have finally accessed and become learned in this great culture of Jewish men, taking on leadership roles within the community and studying and being acknowledged as experts in the texts that go along with those roles. While I don't by any means denigrate traditional Jewish roles of women, particularly those of home and marketplace was indeed very significant for Jewish women, those are not the concerns by which I happen to define myself, and that creates a limitation for me. So how to identify a model? That was the mandate of the program. We have a few glimpses of powerful women in the Bible, by women who were not defined solely by their infertility and subsequent motherhood. People like Deborah the judge, and perhaps the leader of her people in the battles with Sisera, but according to rabbinic tradition, she was not really public in this role, and she actually worked through her husband, Barak. So she wasn't somebody who was out there doing this herself quite. She was sitting under her palm tree. Esther, of course, was a fortuitously located, beautiful member of her husband's harem. So I reject her too. In the rabbinic period, we know that Bruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir, a sage in the 2nd century, was learned, but we have maybe 1.5 traditions about what she taught, so we can't build a whole 8-minute lecture about her. From the 18th century, we have finally a diary of a woman named Glickl of Hameln, but she ran a business empire. The same is true of the fabulously wealthy 16th century Donna Gracia Nassi, who was born to a converso or new Christian family in Portugal, and ultimately was able to live publicly as a Jew in Italy. Through strategic use of her family's wealth, by which I mean that she bribed kings and popes very liberally, she was instrumental in protecting these conversos from the Inquisition and in developing institutions of public Jewish life outside the realm of Christendom, primarily in the Ottoman Empire. But neither of these two women, of whom we know a great deal more, were prophetic women for our time, as I define it, i.e. religiously learned and powerful people. The consequence of this is that I either need to focus on near contemporaries in a search for models, or that we as a community end up building imaginatively on the few clues that are preserved from in history to construct models for ourselves. And this active construction is precisely what a few female novelists have been doing, writing historical fiction. Grounding their work in significant research, what does exist about the worlds in which they set their stories, but often elaborating on a really tiny, tiny handful of clues, and sometimes not even clues, but really rumors, to construct a novel which is, I'm afraid, often more reflective of the values and the concerns of the author than it is of good history. And that's my example for tonight, is Maggie Anton's series, Rashi's Daughters, where she's published 2 out of the 3 books of the trilogy now, and it's an intriguing example of such a reconstruction. She's done significant research on our burgeoning knowledge about the lives of Jewish women in general in this period, but then she presents the facts that apply to the Rhineland, to France, from the 11th to the 14th century as all applying to this one family that is living in the late 11th century. And so she presents some things as happening in this family, even when we know very clearly that Rashi himself opposed them. Rashi is an acronym for a great man. His name was Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki. He was the Jewish Aquinas of his age, if you will. He was trained in the Rhineland academies that towards the end of his life were wiped out by the Crusaders. But before the Crusades, luckily, economic circumstances forced him to return to run his family's vineyards in France, in northern France. His commentaries on the Bible and the Talmud became the repository of these Rhineland teachings and are the primary commentaries used to study these texts in the Jewish world even today. So the issue that has fascinated generations of feminists is that Rashi had no sons. He had 3 daughters. All 3 of these daughters married learned men. Several of their sons themselves became leading sages, men whose voices we still study today. It's one of these, and not Rashi himself, his grandfather, that is our primary authority for enabling women's greater involvement in Jewish ritual life. But Anton makes this Rashi's decision, based on his daughter's prompting, and this is where his daughters become powerful. Based on the few hints preserved in the literature, and even more imagination, it became common knowledge among women in our day that Rashi, lacking sons to teach, taught his daughters what had previously been exclusively male knowledge. He taught them Talmud. And that he allowed, or perhaps even encouraged his daughters to take on the daily ritual, almost always restricted to men, of praying with tefillin, which is usually translated with the very helpful word phylacteries, but that refers to the black box which contains parchment containing texts of central prayers, which is worn during prayer on the forehead and on the forearm. On the basis of this, Maggie Anton has published these first 2 volumes of her trilogy, telling the story of a remarkable window in Jewish history when women, perhaps influenced by the religious revival going on in Christian France at the time, seem to have taken on a more active and public religious role. She portrays these young women in a model we know of from the Rhineland as those responsible for leading prayer in the women's section of the synagogue. She develops what might have been their private learning into a public, if still peripheral, role in their father's academy, interacting regularly with the male students and keeping pace with the male group's learning. More plausibly, she portrays them as their children's primary teachers and as private interlocutors with their fathers and husbands over Talmudic matters, raising questions, helping them decide issues. In a somewhat more problematic mode, she describes the struggles of the second daughter to be accepted as the community's mohelet, as its ritual circumciser. In reality, while she presents this as a problem, evidence suggests that actually in 11th century France this was not unusual. It may have not happened regularly, but it was considered normal. And women were restricted from this role only in the 14th century. So she's adding some feminism there because she wants that fight. Consequently, then, the communal tensions that Anton is portraying are often more reflection of the 21st and 20th century feminist movements than they quite are of the history itself. But Anton has written a piece of historical fiction that is a good read, and one that I'm glad to be sharing with my 16-year-old daughter, who is a young woman who herself is struggling with the possibilities for women's learned leadership in a traditional Jewish world, one that is still very much dominated by men. These novels serve this need more because they deal with these questions in good ways than because they're good history. However, academically honest history can only offer us tantalizing glimpses of what might have been and can't give us that fuller picture. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Sean Copeland, and my thanks to Sheila for inviting me, and Pat DeLu for encouraging me to be here today. Subtle encouragement from the provost of faculty. So. thanks to all of you for coming out on such a dreary night. When I was 12 years old, Leona Behnke, who was a grown-up friend of mine, gave me a copy of Louis de Wohl's Lay Siege to Heaven, a novel about Catherine of Siena. By contemporary aesthetic and critical standards, this work would be marginal, quite insignificant. But at 12, I was impressionable, on the verge of adolescence, worrying about high school choices, already concerned about college, and trying to figure out if law school was the right path for me. At that time, this rather marginal book introduced me to someone who became a companion, a friend, and an inspiration. Catherine of Siena was born in 1347, the youngest daughter of Giacomo Benincasa and Lapa Piacenti. Because her father was a rather prosperous dyer, her childhood was relatively comfortable by those standards. Early on, she resolved to give herself totally to Christ, and although she wavered briefly in her resolve, she regained her poise, refusing an arranged marriage, even dramatically cutting off her hair. Catherine was determined to live as a Montellate. These were laywomen who lived lives of prayer and service from their homes and who were associated with religious orders. In Catherine's case, this was the order of preachers, more familiar to us as the Dominicans. Gradually, her example of intense prayer, extraordinary love and service to the poor and abject impressed other women and men, and she gained wide influence as a woman of love and peace, of passion and joy, and of authority. Eventually, Catherine attracted her own familia, a family of her own, friends and followers who valued her words, her integrity, her courage, and her holiness. Every age has its characteristic features, but the 14th century in which Catherine lived, much like our own, was marked by the desire to find and hold on to truth, by conflict in church and culture and society, by dissent from prevailing beliefs and doctrines and theories operative in church, in culture, in society, by the need for transformation, for conversion in church, in culture, in society, in intellectual and moral personal life. Catherine put herself in the midst of these tensions. She worked to broker peace between the warring city-states of Italy. She persuaded Pope Gregory XI, despite enormous opposition from cardinals and the King of France, to leave Avignon, where he had fled during the wars in Italy, and return to Rome. And when the Great Schism broke out in the Church, two rival groups of cardinals electing two rival popes, she threw her authority behind Urban VI. Across more than 6 centuries, Catherine of Siena, I think, speaks to us. Open your mind's eye and tear out every root of selfish love and self-pampering, so that you may come to know God's truth. She speaks, as her biographer Raymond of Capua suggests, under a kind of divine compulsion. Catherine has a prophetic calling. Her vision and her mystical experiences result in a prophetic mission for reform in church and society. In her dialogues, Catherine is an unschooled person, and she somehow receives a gift of writing, but later in her life. But there's at this stage in which she's dictating what really are mystical visions to a secretary. And in one of these dialogues, Christ says to her, "You will give proof of the Spirit that is in you before the small and great, before layfolk and clergy and religious, for I will give you a mouth and a wisdom which none shall be able to resist. I will bring you before pontiffs and the rulers of churches and the Christian people, in order that I may do as is my way, and use what is weak to put to shame the pride of the strong." In her response to this prophetic charge, Catherine moves and acts and speaks by divine authority, even as she transgresses social convention and ordinary ecclesiastical norms by preaching and teaching in public. Susan Nofke, who has studied the life and writings of Catherine of Siena quite thoroughly and intensely, observes that, quote, "At the base of all Catherine's thinking about justice is God's truth. All justice for Catherine is founded upon this truth within the individual, this living according to God's truth in relationship to oneself, with God, and with other persons," end of quote. We do truth not only in our own individual lives, but also in the wider social order for the common human good. Catherine urges us, quote, "Give everyone justice. Do the right thing for everyone, the small as well as the great, the poor as well as the rich. Let your justice not be corrupted by flattery or threats, by approval or disapproval, but keep the scales steady, giving each person what reason requires." At 12, I was impressed and challenged by a woman on fire with love for God and for humanity, especially the poor and the abject, the troubled and confused. Catherine of Siena changed the face of her world and our church, and she made me want to do the same. Indeed, she still does.
And I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you this evening about Mother Julian, Julian of Norwich. Julian was an anchoress, a peculiar sort of hermit of the late 14th century in England. Anchorites, the male version, and anchoresses were recluses who lived not in the wilderness as the first monks and nuns had, but enclosed within small houses in a town, often built in the churchyard and built attached to a church. These were religious lives outside religious orders. There was even a special liturgy of enclosure that was used when the anchorite or anchoress was sealed into his or her little bungalow. Sealed does not mean that there was no contact between the anchoress and the outside world, however. While the anchoress could not leave, the world could certainly come to her. Anchoresses, like Julian, were the local holy women. In an age before counseling was a doctoral program, one could sit outside the hut of the anchoress and commune with her. And people from every walk of life did, and many traveled long distances to do so. The little we know about Julian's life comes from the great work that she dictated, the showings or revelations of divine love. The revelations are the result of some 20 years of meditation by Julian on the meaning of a series of revelations of Christ's passion that she had had while she was gravely ill. She probably wasn't enclosed when she was ill and had the revelations, but 20 years of enclosure, plenty of time to commune with others, led to the dictating of the book that we know as the Revelations. The Revelations themselves have all the hallmarks of late medieval piety and focus on the suffering humanity of Jesus. It is this same piety of the late Middle Ages, incidentally, that leads to the crucifix and the statue of the Pietà. They are remarkable in their color and detail. In the Revelations, Julian sees Jesus' red blood trickling down from under the crown of thorns, as she says, hot, fresh, and plentiful. When she watches Jesus die, she sees the color of his skin pass from rosy to pallid to blue and then brown in death. In a meditation on heaven, she sees, and I quote, "The Lord as head of his own house, who had invited all his dear servants and friends to a great feast. He presided regally over it all, suffusing it with joy and cheer. Utterly at home and with perfect courtesy, he was the eternal happiness and comfort of his beloved friends, the marvelous music of his unending love, showing in the beauty of his blessed face. Julian's God is always homely, always courteous, and heaven is the sort of place where we'd all like to go. One can almost hear the crackle of the fire in the fireplace and smell the roast in the oven." There's been a great deal of scholarship on Julian in the past generation, including 2 recent dissertations in our own Department of Theology. The consensus is that Julian, despite her claim to be unlettered, whatever that would have meant in the late 14th century in England, was a sophisticated theologian who knew a great deal of the Christian tradition and contemporary spiritual writing. Julian's revelations are about the economy of salvation. Her understanding is that Adam's sin was the greatest wrong ever done, but that the reparation of Jesus' suffering and death was much more pleasing and honoring to God than the sin had been harmful. Indeed, for Julian, the lesson is that God shall make good all wrongs of whatever degree. Or, as Jesus says it to Julian, sin is inevitable, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. In a long extended metaphor, Julian tells the story of Adam's sin as the accidental fall of a servant into a ditch, a fall from which he cannot recover on his own. The servant's Lord regards him with unceasing love and compassion, and through the death of the Lord's Son, he lifts his servant up. So what is the meaning? For Julian, the story, our story, the only story, is about love. While Julian did not invent the language of God as mother, she perfects it. Let me read you a small example of Julian on Jesus as mother. A mother's is the most intimate, willing, and dependable of all services, because it is the truest of all. None has been able to fulfill it properly but Christ, and he alone can. We know that our own mother's bearing of us was a bearing to pain and death. But what does Jesus, our true mother, do? Why, he, all love, bears us to joy and eternal life. Blessings on him. Thus he carries us within himself and love. And finally, for those of you, please forgive me, who know this text as well as I do, Julian ends her book of Revelations of Divine Love with these words. So it was that I learned that love was our Lord's message, and I saw for certain both here and elsewhere that before ever he made us, God loved us, and that his love has never slackened nor ever shall. In this love, all his works have been done, and in this love, he has made everything serve us, and in this love, our life is everlasting. Our beginning was when we were made, but the love in which he made us never had beginning. In it, we have our beginning. All this we shall see in God forever. May Jesus grant this. Amen. Amen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Colleen Griffith, and this is one great way to start Lent. That's all I have to say. In celebration of historic women. May it continue. I'd like to share this evening an historical person that I've been reading and learning from for many years. Somebody whose life story and writings particularly have affected the way that I think about Christian spirituality. And this person is Evelyn Underhill. Underhill was born in 1875 in Wolverhampton, England, and she died in 1941. So we're talking about an early 20th century figure here. She was the first woman invited to give a series of theological lectures at Oxford, and the first woman invited to lead clergy retreats in the Anglican Church. Now, I don't know what you think about that, but typically those aren't the same people. I think that says a lot for her theology and a lot for her practical work. She was the author of the classic text Mysticism, a comprehensive study of religious experience, a book which 2 years past its publication date was in its 5th edition. A prolific writer, Underhill authored over 30 books and hundreds of articles on the spiritual life. A woman of intellect and depth, she had a commanding way of communicating, and she proved a superb spiritual guide. I'm attracted to Underhill for many reasons. I like the questions she raises. Questions like, what does a heightened consciousness of God really look like? What serves to foster it? What does it create? How accessible is it? And I'm attracted to her responses, particularly the case that she makes for a practical mysticism, something to which she believes we're all very much called. In the early 20th century, few voices witnessed to the mystic way as powerfully as Underhill. Mystical writings from our tradition were largely out of print in this time. People were suspicious of the term itself. Underhill demythologizes mysticism. She carves out intelligible space for it. She puts us in touch with the passion of historical mystics from the Christian tradition, and then invites us to the practice of it ourselves, as it's something she views to be integral to spiritual life. Another point of attraction. I'm refreshed by Underhill's multiple references to God. In addition to her use of more traditional metaphors for God, one finds her describing God as the real, capital R, givenness, capital G, wholeness, capital W. I'm particularly drawn to her description of God as creative spirit. You know, spirit-centered language is prevalent in the writings of women mystics throughout the tradition, and I think they carry huge appeal to many contemporary women as well. A third reason why I'm attracted to Underhill, I like the way of knowing that she values and that she encourages in her writing. A full-bodied, heartful knowing that gets expressed in concrete, direct, affect-laden language. Underhill says that real knowing is, quote, far more accurately suggested by the symbols of touch and taste than by those of hearing and sight. She writes with appealing humor and vivid word pictures about the most serious of things. In her book, The Spiritual Life, Underhill states that exercising our mystical faculty takes, yes, attentiveness and work and discipline, quote, if not the renunciation of the cloister, then at least the virtues of the golf course. More than anything else, Underhill really understood the need for the contemplative element in early 20th century life. I suspect that this need is all the more pressing in 21st century life. The goal regarding contemplation, as articulated by her, was not to become a contemplative by career, but rather that we, quote, transfuse our present lives of action and service with a spirit of contemplation, end of quote. For her, fostering a contemplative spirit meant, yes, developing in prayer. And Underhill had lots to say about prayer. She likened prayer to a garden in which one found everything from alpines to potatoes. She said, too, that it was like a giant ocean in which elephants can swim and lambs can paddle. According to Underhill, no saint will exhaust prayer's possibilities, and it's something that everybody can participate in. Did she encourage specific prayer forms? Well, she commented on many for sure, but urged people to choose ways of prayer that left them most supple before God. Choose prayer forms that most refresh, that brace, that expand us. In other words, that energize us, that support us in trying times, and that challenge us to be more inclusive. You see, for Underhill, and this is one of her best insights, any authentic deepening in spiritual life must at one and the same time signal greater expansiveness, a widening of heart, more inclusive ways of thinking and being and loving. Perhaps the most enticing and challenging area of her thought is her presentation of practical mysticism. She's much less interested in definitions of mysticism than in its practice, and she's particularly persuasive in her urging of its practice. If moving deeper for Underhill means moving more expansively, mysticism and her construal of it implies a way of life very much linked to social concerns. There's nothing otherworldly or pietistic about Underhill's mysticism. It is the art of union with reality. As one's union with God grows, so does one's identification with humanity and the earth. As such, Underhill's mysticism is active and practical. She writes, "The riches and beauty of the spiritual landscape are not disclosed to us in order that we might sit in the sun parlor, be grateful for the excellent hospitality, and contemplate the glorious view. Our place is not the auditorium, but the stage, the field, workshop, study, laboratory. We're to be agents of God's creative spirit in this world." End of quote. In other words, advance in the spiritual life means accepting a very worldly vocation. So how does one become a practical mystic? Underhill says that we do it by an educative process. Cooperating with God's fashioning, we become the more capable of looking at God and working in the vineyard, of living flung open to the initiatives of God's Spirit and working for mercy, order, beauty, mending what's broken, creating where there is need. She says this leads us to, quote, union with the flux of life and union with the whole in which all lesser realities are resumed. Becoming a practical mystic, says Underhill, involves a simplification of our tangled and often very cluttered characters, emancipation from the unreal, and the training of attention, something which practices of meditation and recollection effect. No small order, but the possibility of it so attracts. The sway of Underhill's vision, once it becomes better known, has the potential to spill well over into our 21st century, where we stand in more need than ever of communities of faith which foster a practical mysticism. Nearly 100 years after the publication of Underhill's classic text Mysticism and her subsequent publication Practical Mysticism, the writings of the mystics in the Christian spiritual tradition are sadly still too little known. And precious few contemporary folks are aspiring to become practical mystics. Perhaps we too are guilty of some faulty assumptions, misconceptions, thinking that mysticism remains the realm of the few, the proud, and the brave. In Underhill, we catch sight of a spirituality of ordinary life, achieved not through heroics and hijinks and intense ascetical practices, but through an increased capacity for union with God and union with the real. The life and work of Evelyn Underhill helps us to see more clearly the wholesomeness of the amazing, awesome call to become practical mystics. We can afford to be less tentative about taking beginning steps toward this end. Hey, it won't take the renunciation of the cloister, just maybe some of the virtues of the golf course.